Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about central banking. They assume that when the Federal Reserve prints money, it's creating currency out of thin air to solve immediate problems. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? The government needs to spend, the Fed creates money, the system continues. But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how modern monetary systems actually work. The Federal Reserve isn't printing money it has. It's printing money it can never have. And the difference between those two things is not semantic, it's structural. It's the difference between a temporary fix and a permanent trap. And once you see how this trap functions, you start to notice something deeply unsettling. The system isn't breaking down despite the Fed's actions. It's breaking down because of them. And the people running this system know it. They've known it for years. Which raises a question that should make anyone pause. If the Federal Reserve understands that its current monetary policy is destabilizing the global financial system, why does it keep doing it? Why does it accelerate when the warning signs flash red? The answer is not what most people expect, and it's not comfortable to say, but the evidence points somewhere most people don't want to look. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what the Federal Reserve actually represents. Most people imagine central banks as institutions that manage currency supply to maintain economic stability. That's the textbook definition. But that definition misses the structural reality. The Federal Reserve doesn't exist in isolation. It exists as one component within a larger system, a system that requires specific conditions to maintain its internal logic. That system is what economists call the petrodollar architecture. But the technical term obscures what's actually happening. Let me walk you through exactly how this works, because once you see the architecture, everything else clicks into place. Here's the foundation. Global oil trade, which represents roughly 100 million barrels per day moving through international markets, is almost entirely denominated in US dollars. When China buys oil from Saudi Arabia, that transaction happens in dollars. When India purchases from Iraq, dollars. When Germany imports from Norway, dollars. This creates permanent structural demand for American currency regardless of America's economic fundamentals. Countries need dollars not because they want to hold dollars, but because they need dollars to buy energy. That distinction is critical. It means the demand is systemic, not voluntary. Now layer on top of that the question of where those dollars come from. Countries acquire dollars primarily through trade with the United States or through dollar-denominated debt markets. But here's where the architecture reveals itself. The United States has run a trade deficit, meaning it imports more than it exports, every single year since 1975. In 2023, that deficit reached $773 billion. Think about what that means structurally. America sends dollars overseas in exchange for goods. Those dollars accumulate in foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds. Those institutions then need somewhere to park those dollars that's both safe and liquid. The answer is U.S. Treasury bonds. Foreign entities currently hold approximately $6 trillion in U.S. government debt. This is where most explanations of the petrodollar system stop, as if this arrangement were stable and self-sustaining. But that's exactly wrong. The system is not stable. It's a trap, and the trap has a name. It's called Triffin's dilemma, named after the Belgian economist Robert Triffin, who identified this structural contradiction in 1960. Here's the dilemma in its simplest form. For the world to have enough dollars to conduct international trade, the United States must run persistent deficits, sending dollars abroad. But the more dollars that accumulate overseas, the less those dollars are worth relative to the claims they represent on the U.S. economy. Eventually, the gap between the number of dollars in circulation and the productive capacity those dollars supposedly represent becomes untenable. At that point, either the deficit stops, which crashes the global system, or the deficit continues, which crashes the dollar. There is no third option. This is not a policy choice. It's a mathematical trap built into the structure of a reserve currency system. Now fast forward to today. The United States federal government carries $2 trillion in debt as of early 2025. Annual interest payments on that debt now exceed $1 trillion, which is more than the entire defense budget. The Congressional Budget Office projects that under current policy, the debt will reach $54 trillion by 2034. These are not abstract numbers. They represent claims on future American productivity, claims that cannot be honored through growth alone because the growth required would need to average 6 to 7% annually for a decade. And the U.S. economy has not sustained that rate since the post-war boom. So where do the dollars come from to service this debt? The Federal Reserve. Between 2008 and 2022, the Fed's balance sheet expanded from $870 billion to $9 trillion. That expansion represents money creation on a scale unprecedented in peacetime history. And here's what almost nobody discusses honestly. That money is not backed by anything except the assumption that the system will continue indefinitely. There is no gold. There are no reserves. There is only the shared belief that dollars will retain value because everyone else believes dollars will retain value. Let me show you exactly why this creates the structural crisis we're watching unfold. When the Federal Reserve creates money to purchase treasury bonds, it's not actually purchasing anything in the conventional sense. It's creating a liability on its own balance sheet and exchanging it for a liability of the U.S. government. The Fed now holds roughly $6 trillion in Treasury securities. But here's the structural problem. The Fed cannot reduce its balance sheet to previous levels without triggering deflation severe enough to collapse the debt markets. Why? Because if the Fed sells those bonds back into the market, it removes liquidity from the financial system. Less liquidity means higher interest rates. Higher interest rates mean the government's debt service costs become literally unsustainable. At 5% interest rates, the U.S. government would be paying $8 trillion annually just in interest. That's 38% of all federal revenue going to interest payments alone before a single dollar gets spent on defense, healthcare, or anything else. The system cannot survive that ratio, which means the Fed cannot stop creating money, but it also cannot continue creating money without eventually destroying the dollar's credibility as a store of value. This is Triffin's dilemma manifesting in real time. Think about what happens when this dynamic plays out across the global system. Countries that hold dollars and dollar-denominated assets, primarily treasury bonds, watch the Fed expand its balance sheet year after year. They understand what's happening. Currency debasement through systematic inflation. The dollar in their reserves loses purchasing power steadily and predictably, so they face a choice: continue holding assets that are deliberately losing value, or begin reducing dollar exposure. But reducing dollar exposure creates its own cascade. If major holders begin selling treasuries, yields rise. Rising yields make U.S. debt more expensive to service. More expensive debt service requires more Fed intervention. More Fed intervention accelerates the loss of confidence. The system enters a feedback loop where the actions required to maintain stability in the short term guarantee collapse in the medium term. Now add to this something that makes the dynamic particularly significant. The United States maintains global military presence that costs roughly $900 billion annually when you include overseas operations, veterans affairs, intelligence services, and nuclear weapons maintenance. That presence serves multiple functions, but one of them is protection of the very trade routes and energy flows that maintain the petrodollar system. The Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf, the Seventh Fleet in the Pacific, the network of bases across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. All of this requires funding. Funding that comes from deficit spending. Deficit spending that requires the Fed to create money. Money creation that undermines the very currency that the military presence is designed to protect. The circle closes. The system requires American military dominance to function, but maintaining that dominance requires fiscal spending that destroys the system's foundation. Let me give you a concrete example of how this structural trap manifests in actual policy decisions. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed after a run triggered by rising interest rates that decreased the value of its bond holdings. Within 48 hours, the Federal Reserve announced a new lending facility called the Bank Term Funding Program, which would allow banks to borrow against their bond holdings at par value rather than market value. Translation: the Fed created a mechanism to prevent banks from having to recognize losses on bonds that had decreased in value because of the Fed's own interest rate increases. This is not monetary policy. This is system preservation at the expense of market discipline. The Fed cannot allow interest rates to rise to levels that would actually combat inflation, because those levels would bankrupt significant portions of the financial system that have structured themselves around permanently low rates. But it also cannot keep rates low enough to prevent that bankruptcy, because low rates accelerate inflation and currency debasement. Here's another example that reveals the same pattern. In 2020, when COVID lockdowns triggered economic contraction, the Federal Reserve purchased $120 billion in bonds every month for over a year. By mid-2021, inflation began accelerating beyond the Fed's stated 2% target, reaching 1% by June 2022. The Fed's response was to raise interest rates from near 0 to 5% over 18 months. But here's what's critical. Even at 5% real interest rates, meaning the nominal rate minus inflation, remained close to 0 or negative for extended periods. The Fed was not actually tightening monetary conditions. It was performing tightening theater while maintaining loose conditions in real terms. Why? Because actual tight money would trigger the debt crisis. Governments, corporations, and households have collectively borrowed based on the assumption that money will remain cheap. Total global debt reached $307 trillion in 2024, which is 336% of global GDP. That debt cannot be serviced at historically normal interest rates of 6 to 8%. The system has trapped itself in a regime of permanently suppressed rates and ongoing currency debasement. Stay with me here because this is where it clicks. The Federal Reserve is not incompetent. The people running these institutions are sophisticated analysts who understand monetary theory and systemic dynamics better than almost anyone. Which means they know that the current path leads to currency crisis. They know that you cannot indefinitely expand the monetary base without consequences. They know that Triffin's dilemma has no solution within the existing framework. So why do they continue? This is where we need to think about incentives and time horizons. The alternative to continued monetary expansion is immediate contraction, recession or depression, mass unemployment, asset price collapse, political upheaval. The people who would experience those consequences are here now. They vote now. They protest now. The people who will experience currency collapse are diffused across time and space. Some of them haven't been born yet. The incentive structure is entirely oriented towards short-term stability at the expense of long-term viability. This is not conspiracy. It's a rational response to institutional incentives. But there's a deeper pattern here that deserves serious attention. Every empire that has issued reserve currency has faced this same structural trap. The British pound sterling served as the primary reserve currency from the mid-1800s until the mid-1900s. Britain ran persistent deficits to supply the world with pounds. Those deficits eventually exceeded Britain's productive capacity. The pound collapsed as a reserve currency between 1945 and 1971, not because of military defeat, but because of structural overextension in the monetary system. The Roman denarius faced debasement so severe that by the 3rd century CE, coins that had been 90% silver were reduced to less than 5% silver content. The empire didn't stop debasing the currency because it couldn't. The military required funding, the bureaucracy required funding, the debts required servicing, and there was no other source of money except debasement. The empire chose immediate survival over long-term stability until the gap between nominal value and real value became so extreme that the currency system collapsed entirely. We are watching the same pattern unfold in slow motion. The Federal Reserve cannot stop monetary expansion because the system's immediate survival depends on that expansion. But the expansion itself is the mechanism that guarantees eventual collapse. Now project this forward, and what you see is not chaotic or unpredictable. What you see is a very deliberate sequence of events. The Fed continues expanding the monetary base because the alternative is immediate crisis. Foreign dollar holders watch this expansion and gradually reduce exposure. China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia have all announced or implemented programs to conduct bilateral trade in currencies other than dollars. Oil transactions in yuan, ruble, and rupee are increasing, not because these currencies are superior, but because dollar risk is becoming unacceptable. As dollar demand decreases, the Fed's ability to export inflation through the reserve currency mechanism weakens. Inflation that would previously have been absorbed globally now concentrates domestically. The American public experiences sustained price increases that cannot be offset by wage growth. Political pressure mounts for the Fed to control inflation, but controlling inflation requires tight money. Tight money triggers the debt crisis. The debt crisis forces the Fed back to expansion. The cycle repeats at shorter intervals with larger magnitude until something breaks. What breaks? There are three primary candidates. The first is the Treasury market. If foreign buyers withdraw and domestic buyers lack sufficient capital, the Fed becomes the buyer of last resort for U.S. government debt. At that point, the pretense that the Fed is independent from fiscal policy evaporates. The central bank becomes openly subordinate to government financing needs. That transition destroys confidence in the currency faster than the monetary expansion itself. The second candidate is the dollar's reserve status. If enough countries develop alternative payment systems and currency swap arrangements, the network effects that entrench the dollar begin reversing. Reserve currency status is not binary. It's not something you have one day and lose the next. It's a gradual erosion where the dollar remains important but not dominant, used but not required. That transition expands over decades but accelerates non-linearly once it crosses certain thresholds. We may already be past the first threshold. The third candidate is social cohesion within the United States itself. Currency debasement is not just an economic phenomenon, it's a political one. It redistributes wealth from savers to borrowers, from fixed income retirees to asset holders, from wage earners to capital owners. That redistribution creates class antagonism and political instability that manifests as polarization, institutional distrust, and demands for radical policy changes that further destabilize the system. These dynamics are not happening in separate boxes. They interact. Economic competition generates political tension. Political tension makes economic cooperation harder. Harder cooperation makes financial decoupling more likely. Financial decoupling increases debt pressure. Increased debt pressure reduces flexibility. The cycle reinforces itself. And at each iteration, the Fed faces the same choice it faced before. Expand or contract, debase or deflate, postpone crisis or trigger crisis. And at each iteration, it makes the same choice. Postpone, because that's what institutions do. They optimize for survival within their time horizon. And the Fed's time horizon is measured in quarters and election cycles, not decades and generations. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not a central bank making mistakes. What you see is a central bank trapped within a system it cannot escape. The Federal Reserve is printing money it doesn't have because printing money it doesn't have is the only option that keeps the system operational in the short term. But the short term is not sustainable. It never was. The petrodollar architecture was always temporary. It solved the problem of post-war reconstruction and Cold War financing by creating a new problem, the Triffin dilemma, that would mature decades later. We are living in that maturation. The question is not whether the system will transform. The question is how violent that transformation becomes and who pays the cost. The real question is not whether the Federal Reserve can fix this through better policy. The question is whether a reserve currency system can ever escape the structural trap that Triffin identified 70 years ago. Because if the answer is no, if the trap is inherent to the architecture rather than the execution, then what we're watching is not policy failure. What we're watching is the inevitable conclusion of a system that contains its own destruction in its design. Empires do not fall overnight, they erode. And right now, the conditions for that erosion are assembling with remarkable speed. The Fed is not crashing the system on purpose in the sense of conspiracy or malice. It's crashing the system on purpose in the sense that it chooses short-term postponement over long-term sustainability every single time the choice arrives. And that choice, repeated across years and crises, is indistinguishable from intention. The next time you hear about Fed policy, about interest rate decisions, about balance sheet adjustments, try holding all of these things together in the same frame. The debt that cannot be repaid, the currency that cannot hold value, the empire that cannot retreat, the trap that tightens with every passing week. Because they're not separate stories, they're different angles on the same story. And that story is about what happens when a system designed for temporary advantage becomes permanent architecture. And permanent architecture reveals its flaws only when it's too late to redesign the foundation.